Hello, I'm Mr. Jack. For years, I quietly won 90K in the lottery, never telling anyone, thinking my family would finally see me. But when I asked for help, everything turned upside down. The will reading exposed a betrayal that shattered everything. My own son, he was the one who tried to steal it all from me, calling me worthless. But what's worse is what I discovered about my family's hidden truths. Could this be the end of everything I've ever known? It was the late afternoon when I found it, tucked away in the pocket of my old jacket, buried beneath a pile of forgotten receipts and tissues. A crumpled lottery ticket. I hadn't even thought about it for months, not since I'd bought it on a whim one cold day in early spring. It wasn't the kind of thing I usually did, gambling. But something about the routine of the store, the cashier's casual try your luck line, had nudged me to pick one up. I had always dismissed the thought of winning as a fantasy, but today, something felt different. I pulled the ticket out almost absent-mindedly and scratched it off. My heart skipped a beat. The numbers matched. $90,000. It wasn't the kind of win that would change the world, but it felt significant. To me, it was more than just money. It was a small acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the universe had thrown me a bone. Something good in a sea of mediocrity. But I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. I stood there in my kitchen, looking at the ticket in my hand, the weight of it too much to bear. A win that should have felt like a celebration, yet it felt like a secret, one I had to keep to myself, buried under layers of years spent in silence, doing what was expected, never asking for anything. I thought about telling my kids, maybe even asking for a little help with a few things around the house, but the idea of their pity or the expectation of repayment made me hesitate. No, this was mine, something just for me. I'd keep it hidden and live life as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I felt the hollowness of it. $90,000. What good was it if no one cared? It wouldn't change the way they treated me. It wouldn't change the years of being overlooked, of silently holding my family together while they drifted farther away. They had their own lives, their own families, their own worlds. I was just there, in the background. Maybe that's why I didn't tell them. Maybe I wasn't ready to be noticed. I thought about the last time I'd asked for help, a simple thing, like needing someone to pick up some groceries for me. My daughter had promised, but she never showed. My sons, busy with their own lives, never even bothered to call. I had learned not to ask, to do it all myself, to swallow the pride that would have risen if I'd ever spoken up. But now, with this win, I wondered if maybe it was time to ask, to see if they cared at all. That's when I started to test them. I didn't do it in a big way. I didn't confront them or demand anything. Instead, I asked for small things, little favors, like asking for help fixing a leaky faucet or needing someone to take me to the store, simple tasks, things that would be easy enough to do. And each time I was brushed off, left to handle it on my own. At first I was patient. I shrugged it off, but after a while the sting started to sink in. Why couldn't they just help? Why did I have to do everything all the time without ever being seen? I kept my feelings to myself like I always had. But inside, the silence was eating me alive. I was tired of being the silent pillar, holding everything up while everyone else went on with their lives as if I were invisible. I didn't want to be the burden, but at the same time, I didn't want to keep carrying the weight alone. One day, I asked my daughter for help again, something important. Maybe it was a financial issue, or maybe it was a small matter that needed attention. She said she'd help, of course, just like before. But this time, when the time came, she forgot. She apologized, but it was hollow. I couldn't shake the disappointment. It wasn't just that she didn't help, it was that she didn't even try. It hurt more than the other times, because this time it was from her, my own flesh and blood. The one person I had always tried to protect, to love, to support. I stood there staring at her as she made her half-hearted apology, and something inside me snapped. I didn't say anything. I didn't shout. I didn't even cry. But something in me changed that day. I realized I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I had been invisible for so long, but now I couldn't stand it any longer. I needed something more, something real. I needed to be seen. And then I had an idea. I decided to test them, but this time it wouldn't be a subtle request. No, this time I'd let them know that I needed help. Not with a simple favor, but with something that really mattered. It wasn't the money. I knew that. It was about being seen, being heard for once in my life. I thought about telling them about the lottery win. I thought about how they might react. Would they be surprised? Would they care? But I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. Instead, I decided to drop a hint. I wouldn't ask directly, but I would bring it up in passing to see if anyone noticed. I didn't want to be the center of attention, but maybe this was my chance to see if they would finally see me, to see if they would care. And yet, as I stood there in my kitchen, the ticket in my hand, the phone resting on the counter, I realized something. This win, this small moment of joy, had done nothing to change the way I felt. I wasn't sure if the money could change anything. It didn't matter, not really. What mattered was whether I mattered to them. I stared at the phone for a long time, and just as I was about to pick it up and call one of my kids, a sudden thought stopped me. Maybe it was time to leave it all behind. Maybe this win was my chance to walk away from it all. But then, I paused. A deep breath escaped me. It wasn't about leaving. It was about standing up for myself. And in that moment, I realized that the real question wasn't whether they'd help me. It was whether I would even be there when the truth came out. The evening was quieter than usual, with the sun sinking slowly behind the trees outside. The light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table where I sat. I stared at the lottery ticket, still tucked safely in my pocket. It was mine, but no one knew. Not yet. There was a strange weight to it. At first, I'd felt a surge of excitement, but that had faded quickly. What was the point of a win if it didn't change anything? I thought about my family. I always had. The years of quiet sacrifices, the unspoken duties. I had given so much of myself and never asked for anything in return. Now, sitting in this room that had seen so many of my unacknowledged moments, the question gnawed at me. Why had I kept silent for so long? A small part of me had hoped this windfall might be the key to breaking the cycle. But was it enough to change things? Or was it just another secret, another burden I'd carry alone? I had always thought keeping quiet was the right thing to do, that it kept the peace. But now, with that ticket burning a hole in my pocket, I wondered if it was time to stop being the silent one. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the old clock on the wall. The second hand moved in slow, steady ticks. Time was passing, and I was still standing still. I had done enough for them. I had kept everything together for so long, but what had I gotten in return? What had my daughter, my sons, or even my ex-wife ever done for me? They all lived their lives, and I was just a shadow in the background. I had a sudden, sharp realization. What if I wasn't just invisible to them? What if I had allowed myself to fade into the background because I was afraid of confronting the truth? That thought stung more than I expected. I had spent years feeling like a pillar, holding everything up while everyone else moved forward. But I was done with that. I wasn't going to keep hiding behind this silence anymore. Maybe it was time to take a step into the light, even if it meant facing rejection, even if it meant risking everything. The first test, I decided, would be small, a simple request for help. Nothing big, just a little favor, something that didn't require much effort. I would ask my daughter first. Maybe that would be a good place to start. Maybe she'll come through this time, I told myself. It wasn't the first time I'd asked for help. There had been many others, simple requests, help with groceries, a ride to the doctor, something, anything to show that I wasn't just a presence in their lives, but a person. But those moments had always ended in disappointment. Still, I had to try again. I called her, my daughter, and asked if she could help me with something around the house. It wasn't complicated. I needed someone to check the leaky faucet. She said she was busy, but that she would get to it. A polite excuse. Nothing more. I waited. Hours passed, and nothing. The faucet still dripped. The bitterness crept in slowly, but I kept it to myself. I had learned to do that over the years. Keep it inside, let it simmer. But this time, the resentment felt heavier, more pronounced. I had done my part. I had always been there for her, for all of them. And yet, it was as though I didn't exist. The silence from her was deafening, and it left me wondering how many times I had been taken for granted. I called my sons the next day, hoping for a different outcome. I asked them the same simple request. Help me with a few things. Fixing a door handle, picking up a prescription. Easy enough. One said he was too busy with work, the other, well, he just didn't respond at all. The familiar feeling of being invisible washed over me again, but this time it was different. I had expected this. I had known it was coming, but still, it hurt. It hurt like hell. It wasn't just that they hadn't helped. It was the quiet dismissal, the unspoken message that I wasn't worth the effort, that I wasn't worth their time. I felt the walls around me growing thicker, closing in. The distance between us was undeniable, and with every rejection, it became clearer. My family had built their lives, their own worlds, and I was just a shadow in the corner. But even as I sat there feeling the sting of neglect, a quiet voice inside me started to push back. Maybe it wasn't just about being ignored. Maybe it was about my own willingness to accept it. Maybe I had spent so long in the shadows that I didn't even know how to step into the light. That night, after the calls had ended, I sat alone in my living room, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. My thoughts turned inward and I realized something. All these years, I had never once stood up for myself. I had allowed myself to be overlooked, thinking that's how it had to be. But what if it didn't? What if I could change it? The weight of this realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had spent so many years being the one who did everything, the one who sacrificed, the one who kept the peace. But I was tired of being invisible, tired of being the silent one in the background. It was time to change that. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I had spent too much of my life putting others first, and now it was time to put myself first. For once, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would speak up. Tomorrow, I would let my family know how I felt. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they wouldn't. But I couldn't live in silence anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of quiet determination settle in my chest. It was the first time in a long time that I had felt truly alive. And I was ready. The days after the dinner passed slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. The silence between us grew, an unspoken wall that no one seemed willing to break down. I had said my piece, but it didn't have the effect I had hoped for. It was like I had thrown a stone into a pond only for it to sink without making a ripple. At first I thought maybe they just needed time to process, but as the days wore on, it became clear that the distance between us was more than just a temporary gap. They weren't angry with me, not exactly, but they were uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. I could see it in their eyes when we spoke, the way they avoided the topic or gave me vague excuses. It was almost as if they wanted to pretend I hadn't said anything at all. My daughter, for instance, was the first to break the silence. She called one afternoon a few days after the dinner and tried to offer an apology. "Dad, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings," she said, "but it wasn't sincere." I could tell she was more focused on justifying herself than truly understanding where I was coming from. Her words were wrapped in a blanket of guilt, but I could see through it. "I didn't mean to make you feel left out," she continued almost hurriedly. "I've just been so busy with work and everything. You know how it is." And there it was, the excuse that had always been there. The work, the kids, the commitments that kept her from noticing I was still here. But she never asked how I was doing, how I felt, how I was living in the shadows. I didn't say anything in response. I simply let her words hang in the air, a reminder of how much I had given and how little I had ever gotten in return. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't looking for sympathy. I wasn't asking for much. I just wanted to be seen. But I didn't. I didn't want to push her away further. The silence continued, and with it, my disappointment festered. I had hoped that by speaking out, by showing them just how much I had been carrying, they would finally understand. But nothing changed. The gap between us widened. My sons, too, seemed to go on with their lives, oblivious to the fact that I was trying to make a stand. The few times I spoke to them, the conversations were short, awkward, like we were both afraid of the elephant in the room. I made subtle comments, tried to get them to see that something had shifted, but they were too preoccupied to notice. I began to feel like I was invisible, not just to them, but to the whole world. I realized then that nothing was ever going to change unless I made it. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was wasting my time. It wasn't just that they didn't care. It was that they didn't even know how to care. But then, something happened that made everything worse. It was a call from my lawyer, the one I'd never quite gotten around to telling anyone about. It was about my late wife's will. My heart sank when I heard the words, family meeting. I hadn't been prepared for that. The will was meant to settle everything after her death, but I had hoped that it would at least bring some sense of closure, a chance for us to move forward as a family. But what I didn't know was that this meeting would tear us apart in a way I could never have anticipated. The day of the meeting, we gathered at my lawyer's office, my children and I, all sitting around a polished wooden table. The air was thick with expectation, each of us unsure what to expect. I had never been good at navigating these sorts of moments, the ones where emotions are buried under layers of formality. But this time, I wasn't just worried about the money. I was worried about what the will would reveal. When the lawyer finally began reading the document, his voice calm and businesslike, I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me. As the pages turned, the room became more and more silent, each of us absorbing the information in our own way. And then it happened. The will revealed that my late wife had left the bulk of her estate, everything we had built together, to charity. My children, her own flesh and blood, were barely mentioned. I was left with a small portion, just enough to cover my basic needs. The rest, everything else, was to be donated. I could feel the blood drain from my face as the words sank in. I wanted to say something, to scream, but all I could do was sit there, numb. My children were shocked, their eyes wide as they processed the information. But I could see it in their faces. There was no sympathy, no understanding. They were more angry that they had been bypassed than concerned about how I felt. They were offended, not by the injustice of it, but by the fact that they weren't getting what they thought was rightfully theirs. As the lawyer continued reading, he revealed that my wife had intended to divide the estate evenly among the children, bypassing me entirely. I couldn't believe it. She had kept this secret from me, and in doing so, she had buried me even deeper in the shadows I had been trying to escape. My heart felt heavy, my chest tight. It was as if every ounce of my existence had been discounted. My children, the ones I had sacrificed so much for, were suddenly strangers to me. They had been given everything while I was left with nothing, just the remnants of a life I thought I knew. The shock of the will hit me like a freight train. Betrayal, anger, hurt, all of it flooded over me at once. And yet, I didn't know what to do. My children, who had been so dismissive of my pain, were now silent, processing the news in their own way. But there was nothing left to say. I sat there feeling the walls close in around me. I had been living in a world of illusions, thinking that I mattered, that I was a part of something bigger than myself. But now that illusion had been shattered. My worth, my place in this family had always been conditional. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but feel like I had lost everything. My wife had taken the last part of my dignity with her. And my children? They were already moving on, already making plans for the money they thought was theirs. That night I sat in the dark, staring out the window. The quiet seemed deafening. The life I had built, The family I had tried to hold together was falling apart. I had always put them first, always kept quiet, always sacrificed for them. But what had it gotten me? I had a decision to make. I could keep going the way I always had, letting them walk all over me, or I could stand up once and for all and fight for my dignity. The choice seemed clear, but the cost of change was heavy. It was one thing to keep silent. It was another to speak up and risk losing everything. But for the first time, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. The sun was low in the sky as I sat in my chair, the weight of the past few days pressing on me. The reading of the will, the reactions from my family, it all kept swirling around in my mind, making everything feel so much heavier. It was like someone had thrown a stone in my chest, and every time I tried to move, it just kept sinking deeper. I thought back to the night of the dinner when I finally spoke up. I had hoped for some change, a flicker of understanding, but nothing had shifted. The silence that followed was deafening. My children, my own flesh and blood, still couldn't see me. I had put my heart and soul into this family for so many years, and now I was just a shadow in their lives, someone they tolerated but didn't truly see. It didn't matter what I had done, how many sacrifices I had made. They still saw me as a tool, something useful when they needed it, but easily disposable when they didn't. It wasn't just my wife's betrayal that stung. It was the realization that I had been invisible for far too long. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that I had never mattered to them in the way I had hoped. I was never the hero in their story, just a background character. It didn't help that after the will reading, the calls stopped coming. The texts were sparse, filled with shallow phrases that felt more like obligations than care. "How are you, Dad?" Or "Hope everything's good." They were empty words, mere placeholders for the real question. What are you going to do for us now? I began to wonder if I had made a mistake by hoping they would change. Maybe this was just the way it had always been. Maybe I had been living in a fantasy, imagining a world where my children would finally see me as more than just a provider, more than just the person who kept the family together. Maybe they couldn't change because they had never learned how to. The realization hit hard. And I had spent my life trying to earn their love and respect, but it was all in vain. Nothing was ever enough. I had waited for the day when they would finally see me, but all I got was more silence. The bitterness that had been quietly building in me over the years now surged, and I knew something had to change. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about reclaiming what little dignity I had left. I sat there in the quiet, looking out the window. The leaves had started to fall, the season changing around me while I remained stagnant, stuck in this emotional mire. But then something inside me shifted. I couldn't keep living like this. I had spent too many years being taken for granted, too many years quietly doing what was expected of me, and it was time to make a stand. The thought of it wasn't easy. Confronting my children was a daunting task. But the idea of continuing to let them walk all over me, of continuing to let them use me without ever acknowledging my worth, was unbearable. I had to do it. For my own sanity, for my own sense of self. The first step was setting boundaries. I had always been the one who gave, who made sure everything was okay for everyone else. But what about me? What about my needs, my feelings? They couldn't just keep treating me like I was invisible. So I made a decision. I would confront them, not out of anger, but out of necessity. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about finally asserting myself. For the first time in my life, I was going to demand respect, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. I spent the next few days preparing. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about asking for their approval anymore. This was about me taking control of my own life. I wasn't going to beg for their love. I wasn't going to beg for their attention. It was time for me to stop living in the shadows. But that didn't make it any easier. The fear was still there. What if they didn't care? What if they rejected me altogether? The thought of losing them, really losing them, was terrifying. But I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I couldn't keep swallowing my pain for the sake of their comfort. So I called them. I asked them to come over for a family meeting. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it had to happen. It was time to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. The day of the meeting, I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but I knew that this moment would change everything. The air in the house felt thick with anticipation. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands folded in front of me, waiting for them to arrive. They walked in one by one, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and suspicion. No one said anything at first. The silence stretched on longer than it should have, each of us unsure of how to begin. But finally I spoke. "I'm done," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I'm done being ignored. I'm done being treated like I don't matter. I've spent my whole life trying to be what you wanted, trying to be the man you all needed, but I'm not doing it anymore." I could see their faces shift. My daughter looked like she wanted to say something, but she held back. My son's brow furrowed in confusion. No one had ever seen me like this. I wasn't the passive, silent man they were used to. I was the man I should have been all along, standing up for himself. "I won't apologize for needing respect," I continued. "I won't apologize for expecting you to treat me like a human being. You don't get to use me anymore. If you can't respect me, then I'm done." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I wasn't sure what they were going to say. I didn't know if they would understand or if they would walk away, but I knew that I had said what needed to be said. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval, but instead of an outpouring of understanding, the reaction was more defensive. My son tried to brush it off, calling me difficult. "Dad, you're overreacting," he said. "You can't just expect everything to change overnight." I didn't back down. "I'm not asking for everything to change," I said, my voice calm. "I'm just asking for you to treat me like I matter. Is that too much to ask?" The room was thick with tension. Some of them looked uncomfortable, others just angry, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I had finally said what needed to be said. When the conversation ended, there was no reconciliation, no heartfelt apology, just silence. They left, none of them offering the support I had hoped for. But that didn't matter anymore. I had taken control. As I stood there in the empty house, I felt a mix of victory and uncertainty. The quiet that followed was suffocating, but it was also the calm before the storm. I knew I'd set myself on a path I couldn't turn back from, I thought to myself. But with every step forward, I felt the sting of what I might lose.